There are stories that drift like smoke thin, almost forgotten through the cracks of official history. You don't find them in schoolbooks or museums. You find them in whispered legends, yellowed letters, or half-erased maps. They belong, not to the great wars or grand inventions, but to the quiet edges of human life, where something strange happened, and no one could quite explain why. In the summer of 1849, in the newly forming Montana Territory, something very strange began happening. Children started to disappear, one by one, with no struggle, no trace, no sound. And the deeper the settlers searched into the forest, the more it seemed that the forest itself was watching. At the center of it all was a name barely anyone recognized until it was far too late. The Vultners. You might not find Elkhorn Ridge on modern maps, but in 1849, it was a modest frontier settlement wedged between thick pine forest and rising mountains, about 2 days' ride east of what would later become Missoula. It was a town made of raw timber, thick accents, hard work, and quiet hope. Settlers had come to escape crowded cities, to homestead, to mine, or to simply start over. There were around 30 families, many of them from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the upper reaches of New York. Life was difficult, but predictable. Children fetched water from the stream. Women tended gardens and cabins. Men worked saws and scouted for game. There was one schoolhouse, one church, and one road half swallowed by mud. During spring melt. The forest was always near. It hung at the edge of their vision, ancient and quiet. But for most, it was just part of the background, until it began taking their children. His name was Jacob Riley, age 6. Hair like corn silk, always tangled. He loved frogs and had a habit of singing to himself when no one was listening. On May 7th, he was sent with a small hatchet to collect firewood just behind his family's cabin. He had done it dozens of times before. He never came back. At first, his mother thought he was dawdling, distracted by bugs or birds. But when an hour passed and the sky began to shift toward evening, she called for him, then again. Then louder. His father and 3 neighbors searched until nightfall. Then the whole town joined. They found his little basket upright, undisturbed next to a ring of flat stones. No prints, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. The forest gave them nothing. 3 days later, 9-year-old Martha Darn disappeared while walking a fence line less than 10 yards from her mother's window. Then twins from the Eckler family vanished while playing with marbles under the porch. By the end of May, 5 children were gone. Elkhorn Ridge, once a town of quiet industry, had turned paranoid. Fathers stopped working their fields. Mothers kept their children indoors. Windows were boarded. Dogs were chained. Some began whispering about cursed land, Indian ghosts, or strange beasts that crept silently through the trees, but no one agreed on what they were facing. Only that it had started suddenly and showed no signs of stopping. The local Blackfeet, people whose ancestral land surrounded Elkhorn Ridge, had long avoided a stretch of forest to the north. They called it something that settlers poorly translated as the listening place. Old Elk, one of the tribe's elders, spoke with a settler named Anders Higlin during a quiet trade meeting. He warned, "The forest is not empty. There is a family that is not human, not fully. They lived here before your people. They live under the trees. They do not forget." Most settlers ignored these warnings, dismissed them as superstition or resentment, but Higlin believed. He stopped hunting near the northern woods and began sleeping with a loaded rifle. The name Vultner surfaced almost by accident. A traveling merchant named Roy Bell arrived from the Bitterroot Valley, pulling a cart of salt, buttons, and dried beans. He was an old man, stooped, sun-scorched, quiet. When he heard about the disappearances, he went pale. "You've got a Vultner problem," he muttered. Few knew the name. Bell explained. The Vultner clan had settled a ridge deep in the forest decades earlier. No one remembered when. They built homes of sod and stone, spoke an old dialect, and avoided all trade or contact. Strange folk, he said. Too tall, eyes too dark. Kept to themselves, rumors once swirled about their children not aging, about rituals in the woods, about something they had buried and fed. Are they still up there? A settler asked. Bell only shook his head. If they ever left, the forest would look different. In early June, a faded map was found nailed to the inside of the old church's bell tower. No one could say who had placed it there. It was stitched with red ink and odd symbols, but one phrase stood out: avoid. The route line. Do not cross mile 5, the ground breathes. The map showed a forgotten trail leading deeper into the forest, toward a ring of hills, toward the place where the Vultners were said to have lived. Few wanted to admit it, but the disappearances had all occurred within range of that trail. That week, a group of 10 men formed the search party. They were armed, determined, desperate. Only 3 came back. One was mute. One was blind. The last said only, "We were not supposed to look." After that, the disappearances stopped. No more children vanished. No one spoke of the Vultners again, at least not openly, but no one ventured north of mile 5. The forest grew quiet, but not peaceful. Animals refused to cross certain clearings. Birds went silent in strange rings of trees. And now, nearly 2 centuries later, if you look at satellite images of that part of Montana, you'll see something unusual. A circle of healthy forest that simply stops. Some say the ground there still breathes. Some say the Vultners are still listening. What did the search party see in those woods, and why did they never speak of it again? The 3 survivors never spoke to one another again. For a town as small as Elkhorn Ridge, this was unnatural. They passed each other at the church, at the well, or on the single dusty path that served as a main road. Yet they did not greet, did not nod, did not even meet eyes. As if surviving whatever they saw in that part of the forest had burned out the part of them capable of recognizing each other as human. Of the 10 who ventured into the forest on that June morning, only 3 emerged. Their names, Frederick Blake, Silas Hart, and Elijah Runnings. The rest, 7 men in total, including Anders Higland, were never found. No bodies, no weapons, no clothing, nothing. Blake returned with his hair turned white. He never spoke again. Hart was found stumbling barefoot down the trail 2 days after the others. His eyes were open, but the irises had faded into a milk-colored fog. He never saw again. Runnings was the only one who could still speak, and even that was fractured. He was feverish, wild-eyed, scratching constantly at his arms. He talked in bursts. Of roots that reached up like hands. Of rooms beneath the ground. Of singing made of teeth. The town physician attributed it all to trauma. Exposure, possibly poisoned mushrooms. The townspeople weren't so sure. After the search party returned or failed to, the town of Elkhorn Ridge entered a strange quiet. The children stopped vanishing, but no one celebrated. It was the silence of a bruise not yet healed. Families moved closer together. Entire homesteads were abandoned overnight. One woman, Ruth Plow, packed a mule cart in the middle of the night and left with her 3 children without saying goodbye. They were found weeks later, nearly 100 miles south, surviving off boiled roots and jerky. When asked why they had fled, Ruth only answered, "The trees were getting too close to the house." That summer, no one hunted north of the ridge. Dogs refused to cross the timberline. A Blackfeet guide named Nita, one of the few willing to speak about the land's older legends, offered a quiet warning. The Vultners are not a family. They are a wound. Much of what we know or think we know about the Vultners comes from second-hand stories, fragments of letters, and a strange series of birth records found decades later in a sodden journal buried behind the old Elkhorn Chapel. The family's origins remain uncertain. Some claimed they were Prussian, others Dutch, but no official land grants or census entries list any Vultner name in the Montana Territory during the 1840s, and yet multiple separate accounts stretching back to fur traders and early trappers describe pale ones living deep in the forest long before any formal settlement began. 1831. Journal entry from a trapper named Louis Cantrell describes a woman with 4 children, none older than 5, standing barefoot in the snow with no expression at all. The man claimed their cabin was dug partly underground, and their eyes reflected no light. Other records tell of small totem sticks bound with hair and moss hung high in trees far from any trails. Hunters reported seeing movement in the trees with no sound of footsteps. And again, the name Vultner. Some whispered that the Vultners had found a way to live through the forest. Not in it, that their blood had mingled with something ancient. That the trees knew them, and they knew the trees. No one ever found where they buried their dead. Years later, in 1884, during a short-lived logging operation near what was once the Vultner Ridge, workers uncovered what they thought was an old root cellar. It was sealed with flat stones, and inside was not food or tools, but a single child's shoe, and dozens of teeth embedded in clay. The project shut down that same day. One worker, a man named Jonah Fritz, never worked again. He spoke to a doctor in Missoula before disappearing entirely. His words were recorded in a now-lost report, but a surviving letter from the doctor recalls this quote. There weren't walls, there were just eyes, hundreds, all looking out from under the ground, watching. The site was buried. The company went bankrupt the same year. Even after the Vultners had passed fully into legend, their name lingered. Local children in the early 1900s played a game called Vultner Steps. It was a sort of blindfolded tag played in silence, where one child was the Vultner and the others had to cross a circle without making noise. The game was banned in 1907 after a child went missing during recess and was later found asleep under the floorboards of the school, mumbling in a language no one recognized. In the 1930s, a folklorist named Caroline Dalmote traveled through western Montana collecting oral histories. She noted multiple mentions of the ones who wait below, often tied to stories of misbehaving children being taken by the forest's hands. Her notes, never published, include the line, "Whatever the Vultners were, they didn't vanish. They were absorbed." The forest had grown still for decades, but in 1941, a forest ranger named Harold Knapp recorded a strange anomaly while surveying land for fire risk. At the northern edge of the old Elkhorn boundary, he found a patch of moss that moved. Not in the wind. It pulsed. He placed his hand to the ground, and later described the sensation as feeling a heartbeat not under the soil, but through it. He made a note of it, returned the next week, and found the area burned black. No sign of moss. Just ash and a ring of stones around what he described as a sunken hollow. When he asked locals about it, they told him not to return. He didn't. The area was quietly restricted in Forest Service maps beginning in 1943. No explanation given. You might expect stories like this to fade, but they don't. Not entirely. To this day, hikers occasionally report getting lost in the northern woods, despite functioning compasses. Wildlife camera footage occasionally shows brief flickers of tall figures at the edge of night vision. And strange cairns, piles of stone and bone, still appear along the original route line trail, always overnight. Never witnessed. As for the Vultners, no living member has ever been found. No graves, no descendants. No legal paper trail of any kind. Only stories. And in those stories, one detail remains disturbingly consistent across all generations. The Vultners didn't steal children to hurt them. They took them to join them. If the Vultner clan truly vanished in 1849, why do the forest trails still carry the sound of small, barefoot steps? By the end of the 19th century, the name Elkhorn Ridge had all but faded from maps. A few surviving descendants of the original Settlers remained scattered across Montana and Idaho. But the land where the town once stood, its cabins, schoolhouse, and church, was reclaimed by the forest. Roots split rooftops. Snow buried fences. And year after year, moss crept over foundations like a soft shroud. But some things refused to stay buried. In 1968, more than a century after the last reported disappearance, a geotechnical survey was conducted near the Elkhorn site by students from the University of Montana. The purpose: to study seismic stability and soil erosion patterns. They brought with them ground-penetrating radar. What they discovered was never published in full. But one student, Clyde Bernard, kept a personal logbook, now preserved at the University Archives. In it he wrote, "We expected rock, root systems, maybe some shallow caves. What we found looked like rooms, cavities spaced precisely apart, symmetrical. Like a hive, and they weren't empty. Some were warm. Not decaying warm. The equipment malfunctioned the next day." Their guide refused to take them back. Clyde never pursued geology again. In the 1980s, two amateur photographers from Missoula, Donna and Rex Tillman, began a project to document abandoned settlements across the Pacific Northwest. They visited Elkhorn in the fall of 1983. What they found there changed them. Their journal, found years later in an estate sale, includes one entry that reads, "We found children's shoes nailed into trees, dozens, all pointed in the same direction. The shoes were old weathered leather, handmade. Some had dates etched into the soles. The dates corresponded with the months of the 1849 disappearances. No formal report was made." The couple stopped their photography project and left the state. Rex later claimed, in a brief interview, that they had heard a sound while camping at the edge of the forest, a slow, rhythmic tapping beneath the earth. Among the few remaining artifacts from Elkhorn Ridge is a large, wooden clock, its face blank, its pendulum frozen. It was salvaged from the church ruins in 1927 by a railroad inspector. The clock was unique. It had no numerals, no hands, only a spiral of small wooden pegs arranged inward toward the center. The pendulum was wrapped in human hair. Confirmed through modern testing, historians puzzled over its purpose. It was neither decorative nor functional, but in 2002, a local folklorist named Helen Forder compared it to a forgotten Blackfeet ritual object, used to measure not time, but presence. "This was not a clock," she wrote. "It was a tally. Something was being counted, and it stopped when the disappearances stopped." Today, the object remains in storage at a private historical collection in Helena. Visitors are not permitted. Perhaps the most haunting part of the Vultner mystery came in 1994. A fire near the old Elkhorn boundary cleared a section of forest previously inaccessible. When responders investigated the burned zone, they found something inexplicable. 4 children, alive, naked, unharmed. They spoke an archaic German dialect and exhibited no knowledge of modern objects, no recognition of vehicles, flashlights, or even paper. DNA testing was inconclusive. No matches were found in any global database. Ages estimated between 6 and 11. No one could explain where they had come from. They were eventually placed in state care. Records beyond that point are sealed. One doctor, who evaluated them early on, reported a curious physical anomaly. The children's feet were unusually wide, with thick calluses, as if they had never worn shoes, but had walked on forest ground their entire lives. Today, the area once called Elkhorn Ridge is state land. It is closed to campers and hikers due to unstable terrain and wildlife risk. But those who live nearby still speak of strange things. Dogs that bark at shadows and will not enter certain groves. Trees that lean in odd directions, as though bent by something unseen. Fog that collects in one ring and never dissipates. And occasionally, though rarely, there are still reports. A hiker going quiet and never returning. A child's voice echoing in a place where no children should be. 1. Ranger. In 2011, quit his post after finding a handmade doll stitched from pine bark and human hair, resting gently on the hood of his truck. There were no footprints in the snow. What were the Vultners? A cult? A family? Survivors of an older migration? Or something entirely different? Some believe they discovered an ancient survival technique melding with the land, to such a degree they could not be separated from it. Others suggest something darker, that the forest itself changed them, that in seeking isolation, they became something that could never rejoin the world again. Anthropologists avoid the subject. Historians rarely list it. But the locals know. The Vultners didn't disappear. They went where we cannot follow. So ask yourself quietly, and only once, when you walk beneath ancient trees and feel the sudden urge to be still. Is it your mind telling you to pause?